Hey everybody, welcome to another responsive design video. Let's talk a little bit about units. So far in my series of videos, we've mostly been relying on using things like percentages and the occasional M, but I haven't really described what the M is. We've talked about absolute units versus relative units, and we've talked about things like pixels as being absolutes. A pixel is a pixel is a pixel. It doesn't get bigger, it doesn't get smaller, except when it does. I'm not going to go into the funniness of pixels right now, but on different displays, a single pixel might be 3 times the size of a single pixel on a different display. But anyways, really, a pixel is just a pixel is a pixel. It's a dot on the screen. That's it. Now, relative units are a little bit trickier. Relatives are usually relative to some certain context. And we've been talking about percentages all along. And you make a percentage, and that percentage is a percentage of its context, right? So if the thing that you have is 50%, it will be 50% of the thing that's inside of it's inside of. So if I made a wrapper div to wrap up an entire page, you've seen this in previous videos, and I set it at 80%, that wrapper is going to be 80% the width of its containing element. And if its containing element is the root element or HTML, it'll be 80% the width of the web page, essentially. Okay, that's how percentages work. This is not new. These are relative. It's relative to its context. Let's talk about some other relative units. First, let's take a look at my HTML. I have my standard HTML boilerplate that I've always got, the doc type, the root element HTML, the head with all of the meta tags that we need, a title, which I just have it as full of practice. I'm just reusing something that I should probably give it a better name, but I'm not going to because I'm being lazy right now. And I've got a couple of style sheets. I've got one called Normalize, which this is not my style sheet. I'm using it, an open source style sheet from somewhere on the web. And what it does is it resets a whole bunch of the HTML elements to work exactly the same across browsers. We've seen that different elements have different line heights between something like Firefox and Edge and Chrome, and some things have different margins and so on and so forth. This will just give it a baseline so that every single element looks exactly the same on all browsers, right? In a previous series of videos, you might have seen me talk about the CSS reset. And CSS reset is like taking a sledgehammer to carve out Michelangelo's David. Maybe you start with a sledgehammer and then you're fine. This is more refined, where a CSS reset just basically resets everything to kind of a baseline of 0, and then you have to style everything. This is a little more elegant. It leaves certain things their regular sizes, like headings are the regular sizes and fonts are the regular sizes, but it just adjusts things so that they always look the same in all browsers. All right, enough about Normalize. I'm not going to talk about it anymore in any videos, but I'm going to be using it pretty consistently from here on out. So just get used to seeing it. And then I've got another style sheet right now that's blank. It's called unitsstyle.css. And as we've seen before, if I've got multiple style sheets, the one that's lower in the order, so I've got this one on line 7, this one on line 8, Normalize is applied first and units is applied second. So if I create some styles in units that conflict with Normalize, the ones from units will get used. Oh, this is called units style. Got to make sure that I have the name exactly correct. All right, my HTML here is my standard multi-column boilerplate. It's got a div called grid container. It's got a header with an H1, a nav, a series of a UL with a series of LIs. It's got a div with main content. It's got the article in here with an H2 and a series of paragraphs. There's only one article in this one. It's got a sidebar with an article and an H2 and a series of paragraphs. And it's got the footer, and then the container wraps it up at the bottom. If I went too fast for you on this, then you might want to go back to some of my previous videos and really get used to seeing this kind of markup because I use it all the time. All right, so that's the HTML that I have. The things that we're going to be focusing on here are really going to be things like the H1 in the header, paragraphs inside of articles, and such. All right, let's get into what I want to talk about in this video, and that is units. The units that we're going to cover are going to be M, rem, or ch, which is character, and that's about it. I mean, we've already talked about percentages, but percentages may come up. All right, let's talk about the M so we can understand what that is. The M is going to be a unit that is relative to the context. Okay, so much like a percentage is relative to the context, the M is relative to context. EM is not something that is, it's not new just to web design. M has existed in typography for quite a while. The M in typography is the length of the M height of a character. The M height for a font would be from the baseline to the top of the letter M. That is what an M is. M's have been used in typography for quite a long time. It means something a little bit different in HTML though. In CSS and HTML, we use the M as a relative unit, and it's saying that it is a multiplier based on its given context. So let's talk about this a little bit. I'm going to set my H1, I'm going to set it to 1.5 M. Okay, oops, I've got to put font size in front of that. I'm going to set it to 1.5 M. And what that's saying is going to be 1.5 times the size of the default size of its context. Okay? So let's take a look at that in the browser. And you can see right now, my H1 is 1.5 times the default size of the container. It's in a header, and header is inheriting its font size from the root element. It's inheriting the roughly 16 pixels font size from the HTML element. And H1 is saying, I'm going to make this 1.5 times the size of the header. Let's try something here. I'm going to go header, and I'm going to change the font size of the header and see what happens to the H1. And I'm going to do an absolute pixel size here just for demonstration purposes. I'm going to make it 32px. And what should happen is that the H1 should be 1.5 times the size of that 32 pixels. Take a look at it in the browser. Should get bigger. And it did. It got bigger. Okay? This is 1.5 times the size of that 32 pixel context. So I'm going to inspect it using Element Inspector, and we'll take a look. It says font size is 1.5 M's. Okay? If we look at the header is 32 pixels. Okay? So that's showing you how the M's work. I'm going to try something. I'm going to put a little R in front of the M here, save it, and check it. Oh, wow, that got really small. So why did that get smaller when I changed it from M to rem? Well, this is the distinction between M and rem. If M looks at a given context, so H1 is inside of the header, it's going to look at the 32 pixel size of the header and make it 1.5 times the size of that. See, it bumps it up to 1.5 times that 32 pixels. When I make it rems instead of M's, it's looking at the root M. That's what rem stands for. The multiplier by the size of the root element, okay? So root m is 1.5. So my h1 is going to be 1.5 times the size of the baseline font of HTML. Now let's try this. I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna go HTML, and I'm gonna change this to font size 45px. So now the HTML element is going to be 45 pixels in size. My H1s should now get bigger. And it did. Look at that. This is 1.5 rem. And given that my HTML was set to 45 pixels, it's 1.5 times 45 pixels. If I change the HTML size, if I go up to 60 pixels, for example, my 1.5 rem is getting bigger. Using everything's getting bigger. Like when I set HTML to 60 pixels, the baseline for everything becomes 60 pixels. All right? That's not something we generally want to do. We usually want to keep the HTML at its default, which is 16 pixels. We don't usually have to set that. That's set by the browser, and we usually just kind of leave that alone. But now my H1 is a little bit too small when I've got it set to 1.5 rem. H1s are usually 2 rem, so twice the size of the default font. You can make them as big as you want, okay? But this is what a rem is. Rem means that it is relative to the size of the root, which is HTML. M is relative to the size of its context. So if I went 1.5 M, once again, it'll make it 1.5 times 32 because the header exists in, or I mean the H1 exists in the header, okay? So that's the difference between M and rem. I'm going to be using rems and ems quite a bit from here on out, probably mostly using rems for font sizes and ems for things like padding and all that kind of stuff. All right, let's take a look at the CH. CH stands for character width. If I were to just type the letter O here, the CH would be based on the width of that O. So CH looks at the font family that you're using and looks at the character O and sees how wide it is. Now, there are different font families have a different character width. Okay, so if you had something that's a little bit wider, something like a monospace font, it might have a wider character width. So character is relative. It's not a set pixel size. It's the width of the O character in the font family that you're using. Now, why would we ever use this? Generally, in general terms, you don't want to have line lengths in your paragraphs to be super long. General rule of thumb is that you don't want to make a line length longer than 75 characters. And that might even be a little bit too long. And you don't want to have them shorter than about 36 characters. So somewhere in that sweet spot is where you want to have it sit. Too long and it becomes hard to get to the end of the line without losing track. Too short and it's just harder to read because you don't have that great comprehension of putting all those words together across that line. So you want to keep the line length in that sweet spot between around 36 and 75 characters in width. The CH unit is great for setting widths of things like paragraphs. So let's say that I have a container of some sort that is holding paragraph text. So let's say article. I might not want to have my article width go any wider than 75 characters. So I might go max width and set it to 75 CH. That'll ensure that it never gets wider than that. And then I want to set a min width on it. Min width, 36 CH. I'm going to save it, and we'll check it in the browser. Now you can see that my articles are 75 characters wide, and they're not going to go narrower than 36 characters wide. I mean, the font got a lot smaller, but it always stayed no narrower than 36 characters wide. Pretty cool? So that's the CH unit. So in review, we've got the M, which is going to be a multiplier times the size of its context. So if the header was 32 and the H1 is in the header, we would say that the header is the context for the H1. If I set the font size to 1.5 M for the H1, it looks at its context, which is the header, and it multiplies that by that. So it multiplies the 1.5 times 32. Rem looks at the root element. So if my HTML or root element is set to 16 pixels, this is going to be 1.5 times the height of that root element. So 1.5 times 16, right? That's M's and Rems. Character is the width of the letter O in the font. And we use this oftentimes for widths of text boxes to constrain them to a maximum and minimum size so it keeps the text easily readable. All right, thanks for watching.